Elm Ridge Penitentiary wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress buried deep in the desert, surrounded by razor wire, infrared watchtowers, and motion sensors embedded in concrete. It was built for one purpose only: to hold the most dangerous criminals America had ever condemned. No escapes, no contact, and absolutely nothing was supposed to go unnoticed. At least, that's what everyone believed. Inside cell 17 of the solitary wing, a female death row inmate prisoner number 92418 was found dead on her bed. Her name was Natalie Rivers, and she wasn't just any inmate. She had once sat at the center of a transnational black market operation trafficking women, children, and most horrifying of all, human organs across the Mexican border. Cold, calculated, ruthless. Her victims were found dumped in the desert, their bodies hollowed, unrecognizable. The court sentenced her to death without hesitation. And from that moment on, Natalie had lived in total isolation. No one touched her. No one got close. And yet, she was pregnant. When her body was discovered, prison officials initially suspected cardiac arrest. She lay still on her cot, eyes wide open, a plastic cup tipped over beside her. But when her body was brought in for autopsy, the doctor froze in disbelief. Natalie Rivers had been 8 months pregnant, a fully developed baby boy, hidden inside her for months without anyone noticing. No doctors, no nurses, no guards, no one. She had concealed her pregnancy with chilling precision, wrapping her belly tightly with fabric each day, wearing oversized uniforms, manipulating those around her just enough to avoid suspicion. For nearly 8 months, she carried that child under their noses. No male inmates, no visitors, no authorized medical procedures. So who got her pregnant? And more disturbingly, who killed her? Because soon after, investigators found something horrifying: traces of cyanide in the remnants of the plastic cup near her body. A deadly poison, colorless, odorless, tasteless, nearly impossible to detect without an advanced toxicology screen. And when the surveillance team pulled the security footage, the entire solitary wing had suffered a camera blackout precisely during the window when she died. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was an execution. A silent one designed to bury the one person who knew the truth. The baby never had a chance to be born. But his existence tore open the facade of control that this prison had fought so hard to maintain, exposing careers, reputations, and a system that had failed from the inside out. Cell 17 was supposed to be silent, locked down 23 hours a day, soundproofed, tightly monitored, and off-limits to anyone without authorization. But on the morning of May 14th, something felt wrong. Correctional Officer Janice Monroe was making her usual rounds in the solitary confinement wing. She had walked this corridor for nearly 8 years. She knew every flickering light, every footstep, every rustle of movement behind reinforced glass. But that morning, as she passed cell 17, there was no movement, no breathing, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. She tapped on the door with her flashlight. Rivers' roll call. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Still silence. Her chest tightened. Monroe swiped her keycard and pulled the heavy steel door open. At first glance, it looked like Natalie was sleeping, lying on her side, facing the wall, perfectly still. Her orange jumpsuit was rumpled at the waist, but as Monroe stepped closer, her stomach twisted. Natalie's body was too still. Her skin looked waxy, pale, her lips hung slightly open, and beneath the baggy uniform was a clear, unmistakable bulge. No, it couldn't be. Monroe radioed for medical immediately. Within minutes, the corridor was filled with rapid footsteps, urgent voices, and the sharp smell of antiseptics. 2 medics started CPR. Another checked her pupils, but there was nothing. Time of death, 6:42 a.m. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was this: Natalie Rivers, a death row inmate, held in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years, was pregnant. And not just a little. 8 months. The medical team froze. Warden Thomas Vega was called down, still in his bathrobe. His first words weren't, "Is she really dead?" or "What happened?" They were, "Who the hell got her pregnant?" In that cold, bare cell steel toilet, concrete walls, no window chaos erupted. No one could understand how this was possible. There had been no visitors, no transfers, no off-site appointments in nearly a year. Every body search, every meal, every interaction had been logged. Nothing had stood out. Yet here she was, dead, and carrying a nearly full-term child. Her body was zipped into a black vinyl bag and wheeled away, but the questions weren't so easy to seal shut. How had she hidden the pregnancy? Why hadn't anyone noticed? And, most importantly, was her death really natural? The initial autopsy report came back far too quickly, likely cardiac arrest triggered by stress. Warden Vega didn't ask questions. A death row inmate dying a few weeks early. Less paperwork, fewer headlines, case closed. But not everyone was ready to let it go. Dr. Elise Corman, a sharp, detail-obsessed forensic toxicologist with the state medical examiner's office, noticed something was off. The heart showed no signs of trauma, no clots, no inflammation. The lungs were clear. There was no medical reason this otherwise healthy woman should have dropped dead at 8 months pregnant. So Elise ran an extended tox screen. The results were chilling. Cyanide. Just enough to paralyze her respiratory system, just enough to kill her quietly, just enough to vanish unless you knew exactly what to look for. It was rare, colorless, odorless, tasteless, nearly undetectable. But that wasn't the only red flag. Back at Elmridge, a tech reviewing the overnight surveillance logs flagged a strange anomaly. The entire camera system covering cell block C, including cell 17, had gone offline between 2:13 a.m. and 3:42 a.m. No weather disruptions, no maintenance scheduled, no system alerts logged. Just dark. Natalie was found dead less than 3 hours later. And in the corner of the cell, next to the steel frame of her cot, a plastic cup was discovered. It was empty, but the residue inside, when tested, matched the poison found in her bloodstream. From that moment, everything changed. Natalie Rivers hadn't died of stress. She had been poisoned. The toxic substance had been introduced through liquid from inside a solitary cell that no one was supposed to have access to. So the question wasn't just how she died. It was, where did the poison come from? Who gave it to her? Or did she drink it herself? Natalie had once been a powerful player in a brutal international trafficking ring. She knew things, dangerous things, secrets that, if exposed, could bring down entire operations. Was this suicide? Or had the network she once served come back to silence her? Or worse, had someone inside the prison helped cover it up? Oh my God, what really happened inside cell 17? Long before her body was zipped into a black vinyl bag, before anyone discovered she was 8 months pregnant, Natalie Rivers had already earned a reputation that haunted agents across 3 federal agencies. They didn't call her a trafficker or a killer. They called her a ghost, a woman with no past, no fingerprints, no paper trail, only stories, whispers, and bodies. Her name first popped up on a watch list almost 6 years before she was arrested, connected to missing immigrant women near the Arizona border. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Undocumented girls vanished all the time, but these weren't normal disappearances. They followed a pattern eerily precise, almost surgical. The victims were all young, all vulnerable. Most had been promised fake jobs in hotels, in salons, in nursing homes. They were lured across state lines and never seen again. Until they were. Their remains turned up weeks later deep in the desert, dumped like trash, faces unrecognizable, organs missing, no ID, no signs of a struggle, just quiet, methodical death. It wasn't until 2 children were found, a pair of boys, 6 and 9 years old, that the case broke open. They'd been locked inside a storage unit in Tucson for nearly a week, starving, dehydrated, curled up in the dark, covered in bite marks and bruises. When the rescuers opened the door, one of the boys whispered a name through cracked lips. Natalie. That was all it took. Federal agents descended on El Paso. They cross-checked rental cars, surveillance footage, burner phones, and one evening, inside a nail salon near the border, they found her wearing sunglasses, cherry red lipstick, and a cold, unreadable smile. She didn't run. She didn't resist. She just looked up from a magazine, raised one eyebrow, and said, "Took you long enough." Her ID was fake. So was her social security number. But after days of interrogation and a months-long investigation, the web unraveled. Natalie Rivers had been the recruiter, the gatekeeper, and the enforcer of a black market trafficking ring that stretched across 4 states and 3 countries. She wasn't just a player, she was the nucleus. At trial, prosecutors called her a predator with the face of an angel. She never raised her voice, never cried, never showed a flicker of remorse. She sat straight, wore lipstick to court, and smiled through every testimony, even as families sobbed from the gallery. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty. Multiple counts of aggravated trafficking, kidnapping, murder, organ smuggling, and the death penalty. But even then, Natalie didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just nodded slowly, like she had already known it would end this way. What no one realized was that something had changed the moment she entered Elmridge Penitentiary. She wasn't planning an escape. She wasn't planning revenge. She wasn't planning anything, not yet. But then she noticed him. Correctional Officer Scott Murdoch, mid-40s, gray at the temples, downcast eyes, always polite, always quiet, the kind of man who carried his sadness like a shadow. Divorced, 2 kids, estranged. Rumor had it he drank more now. Came to work smelling faintly of whiskey. Still, he had a clean record. 17 years at Elmridge. Trusted, predictable, and lonely. Natalie saw it before anyone else. She didn't smile at him, didn't flirt, not at first. She just noticed how he lingered half a second longer when handing her meal tray through the slot. Noticed how he sometimes looked down when she stood too close to the door. Noticed the faint tremor in his hand when she caught his eye. Most guards treated her like air, or like danger. But Scott was different. And Natalie, well, Natalie had always known how to read men. She didn't plan to seduce him, not in the beginning. It was more instinct than strategy. She asked him once, softly, if she could get an extra blanket, said the cell was colder than usual, thanked him the next day. Then, she started to laugh gently, faintly at his dry, half-muttered jokes. One time, when he dropped a packet of salt and bent to pick it up, she said, "Careful, you're not as young as you used to be." He smiled. It started small. Then, one night, after a shift change left him alone in the solitary wing, something happened. The camera at the end of the hall blinked. A fuse popped. And Scott unlocked Cell 17. No report was filed. No one spoke of it. But when he left 28 minutes later, Natalie was lying on her cot, staring at the ceiling, hand resting lightly on her stomach, like something sacred had just begun. What she didn't know yet was that the life growing inside her would become the fuse to blow the entire prison apart. Because that night wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning And when the baby kicked, when her belly swelled, when the weight became too real to hide, Natalie Rivers would have to make a choice. Reveal the truth, or bury it just a little longer. At first, she said nothing. Even as her belly began to swell, Natalie Rivers kept it hidden with the precision of a woman who had lived her whole life in shadows. She wrapped herself tightly each morning using torn strips of prison linen, knotted beneath her jumpsuit. She walked slower, hunched slightly, blamed the fatigue on chronic stomach pain. When the guards asked if she needed medical, she waved them off. She knew the walls were watching, but she also knew their weaknesses. They didn't look too hard, babe white say. Not when the inmate was quiet. Not when she wasn't screaming or throwing trays or starting fights. As long as Natalie kept her head down, she remained invisible exactly how she liked it. For nearly 7 months, no one noticed. Until the baby kicked. It happened during lights out, a hard, sudden jolt, sharp enough to make her gasp. She rolled onto her side, heart pounding, hand over her stomach. That night, she barely slept. The next morning, Scott Murdoch did something strange. He lingered. She was standing by the door when he passed with the breakfast cart. Their eyes met. He froze for a beat too long, tray in hand. And Natalie's shirt had ridden up just slightly, just enough to reveal a curve that couldn't be explained by bloating. Scott blinked, said nothing, and kept walking. But Natalie knew. He had seen it. That night, during rounds, he stopped again. He cleared his throat. You doing okay? Natalie tilted her head, soft smile on her lips. You've never asked that before. He hesitated. You just look tired. I'm fine, she said gently, just a little heavier than usual. His eyes darted to her waist, his jaw tensed. She let the silence sit for a moment, then leaned closer to the door. I'm 8 months, she whispered, and yes, it's yours. The words hit him like a car crash. Scott took a step back. That's not possible. She said nothing, just watched him unravel. He stammered, No, you can't. How would you even? That was months ago, you said. I didn't say anything, she interrupted, calm, controlled. You're the one talking. He turned, hands shaking, eyes wide with disbelief. His breath came in shallow bursts. He walked the rest of his shift like a ghost. That night, he didn't go home. He drove aimlessly through the desert, past the outer fences of the prison, past the motel where his divorce papers had been served, past the dead-end streets of Elmridge. When he got home, he drank until the bottle was dry. He didn't sleep. For the next few days, he avoided her cell. Took hallway duty instead, swapped posts, sat in the break room staring at the floor. But her words rang in his head like a siren. 8 months. He couldn't believe it, wouldn't believe it, but the math added up. The timeline fit. The way she had looked at him after that night, not seductively, not angrily, but like a woman with a secret that now lived beneath her skin. And if it was true, if she gave birth, the fallout would be nuclear. Even if she never spoke a word, the truth would come out. The state would run a paternity test. The press would go insane. His name, his job, his pension, his kids, all of it gone. And what terrified him most wasn't Natalie. It was how calm she was. She didn't threaten him, didn't blackmail, didn't ask for anything. She just let it sit. And that silence, that terrifying, unbearable silence made Scott feel like he was walking with a noose around his neck. One slip, one doctor's exam, one ultrasound, and it was over. He thought about confessing. Briefly. But then, what admit to having sex with a death row inmate, get charged with misconduct, sexual assault, spend years behind bars, maybe in general population, where guards turned prisoners had the shortest life expectancy imaginable? No. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let that happen. But how do you kill someone who's already on death row without raising suspicion? That question haunted him like a fever. He looked for options, quiet ones. Then one night, after too much whiskey and too little sleep, he remembered something a friend once told him, an old army buddy, now a paramedic. If you ever wanted someone to die and look like it was natural, the friend had joked once, cyanide, silent, fast, clean, you'd never know unless you ran a full tox screen, and no one does that for a heart attack. At the time, Scott had laughed it off. Now, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He started searching, quietly, carefully. A contact in a rural pest control store agreed to ship him a non-regulated rodent solution. He paid in cash. It arrived a week later, disguised in a bottle of vitamin supplements. Tiny crystals. Odorless, tasteless. Lethal. He stared at them in his kitchen that night for over an hour. And then he packed them in his bag. But Scott wasn't a killer. Not yet. Not in the way people imagine. He didn't have a plan. He had panic and desperation and fear. So he hesitated. For 2 nights, he did nothing. Then, on the third, he brought Natalie a treat, a small sealed juice bottle and a few slices of fruit, said she looked dehydrated, said she needed strength. Natalie accepted it without question. Why would she question it? He was the only one who'd ever shown her kindness. He repeated the gesture 2 nights later, then again. Each time, she smiled. Each time, she said thank you. And then came the last night. The camera log showed a brief blackout, 31 minutes. Scott used that window. He entered quietly. No hesitation this time. The plastic cup was already filled. Orange juice, cold, sweet, masked the bitter trace of death inside. He placed it on the tray slot. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said. Natalie looked up from her cot. She smiled and drank half the cup. 15 minutes later, she lay back on her side. Still pale, her lips parted slightly, as if mid-breath. And then, nothing. She didn't scream, she didn't fight, she just stopped. And the only person who knew what had happened was the man who walked away from cell 17 that night without a trace of guilt on his face. But that wouldn't last. Not for long. At 6:42 a.m., the radio crackled. Correctional Officer Janice Monroe had just begun her morning rounds when she reached cell 17 and knocked once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She used her override keycard. The heavy door creaked open. At first glance, it looked like Natalie was sleeping. She was lying on her side, facing the wall. Her uniform wrinkled, one arm draped across her stomach. But something felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Monroe stepped in, heart thudding. "Natalie," she called again. "Roll call." Nothing. Then she saw it, the unnatural tilt of her head, the way her lips hung slightly open, the waxy sheen to her skin, and the cup, lying sideways on the floor, just beside the cot, a faint citrus scent still clinging to the air. Monroe's instincts kicked in. She radioed for medical. Within minutes, the hallway was flooded with footsteps and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Medics began CPR, checked vitals, opened her eyelids, but everyone in the room knew it was too late. Time of death officially marked at 6:42 a.m. But the shock hadn't even begun. One of the medics, Reaching to adjust Natalie's body, froze. His eyes widened. Jesus Christ, what Monroe asked. He stepped back. From the side, beneath the loose orange fabric, Natalie's belly was unmistakable. Large, heavy, round, Monroe whispered. Is she pregnant? The medic said flatly. 8 months, at least. The room went silent. No one moved. The warden was called immediately. Thomas Vega arrived, still half-dressed, tie undone, eyes bleary from sleep. When he entered the cell, he didn't ask if Natalie could be revived. He didn't ask who found her. His first words were, "Who the hell got her pregnant?" No one answered, because no one knew. And that was the problem. No visitors, no male inmates, no conjugal rights, no medical transports, no breaches. Every movement had been logged, every item recorded. And yet, here she was, dead, and carrying a fully developed fetus. Warden Vega swore under his breath, "Lock this place down. I want reports on every staff member who's been near her in the last 6 months. Medical, kitchen, janitorial, everyone." Natalie's body was removed, wheeled out under the cover of a black sheet, but what she left behind couldn't be zipped up so easily. The official incident report was typed and filed within the hour. No signs of struggle, no external trauma. Preliminary cause of death, cardiac arrest due to possible prenatal stress. Case closed. Almost. Because protocol required an autopsy. The Department of Corrections wanted it done quietly. No press, no public mention. Just a quick confirmation. Heart gave out. Unfortunate timing. End of story. But that wasn't what happened. Dr. Elise Corman was only supposed to observe. A junior forensic pathologist with a reputation for being too thorough, too slow, too curious. She was brought in to assist the lead examiner, a man who, at best, wanted to wrap this up and get to lunch. But Elise noticed things. Small things. Natalie's heart looked fine. No scarring. No clots. No ruptures. The lungs were clear. Her liver healthy. Nothing about her organs suggested failure. Nothing pointed to stress or natural causes. "Something's off," Elise murmured. The lead examiner sighed. "She's on death row. These people drop all the time." No big deal, but Elise wasn't satisfied. She filed for a full toxicology panel, knowing it would delay everything. 3 days later, the results came back. Cyanide, traces in the bloodstream, concentration just high enough to shut down respiratory function. No smell, no taste, no color, no chance for survival. And unless someone was looking specifically for it, no trace left behind. Elise walked into her supervisor's office with the report in hand, dropped it on the desk. This wasn't natural, she said. She was poisoned. The supervisor blinked, then sat up straighter. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Elise replied. And whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Suddenly, what had been a tragic inconvenience became something else entirely. A murder inside one of the most secure correctional facilities in the country. And that wasn't even the most damning part. A security technician, running system maintenance checks later that same day, flagged an anomaly in the surveillance logs. A blackout. From 2:13 a.m. to 2:44 a.m., every hallway camera in the solitary confinement wing, including the one outside cell 17, had gone offline. No weather disruptions, no scheduled maintenance, no known power surges, just silence. Exactly 31 minutes of darkness. Just enough time for someone to enter a cell and kill. The administration panicked. Behind closed doors, the Department of Corrections launched a quiet internal review. No public statement, no press leak, just a dozen grim-faced investigators combing through security logs, access badges, medical charts, and staff schedules. The pressure was immediate. Natalie Rivers hadn't died of stress. She had been silenced. But the real question was no longer how. It was why. And more terrifying than that, who else knew? If this death was deliberate, then there had to be a motive. And someone somewhere in the system had just risked everything to keep it buried. The moment the toxicology report confirmed cyanide, the mood inside Elmridge shifted from tension to terror. This wasn't just a medical oversight. It was a security breach, a criminal act committed inside what was supposed to be an impenetrable system, the kind of scandal that destroyed careers, and the Department of Corrections knew it. No press release was issued, no public statement, but behind the scenes, they moved quickly. A task force was assembled: internal affairs, legal advisors, forensic consultants, and 2 high-level federal auditors. Their job: find out who killed Natalie Rivers, how they did it, and how the entire prison missed it. They started with surveillance. The blackout on the solitary wing, a precise 31-minute gap from 2:13 a.m. to 2:44 a.m., raised more than red flags. It screamed intent. There had been no power outage anywhere else in the facility. No technical reports, no alerts, no maintenance work scheduled, and yet, the most critical cameras in the building, the ones outside the most dangerous inmate's cell, had gone dark. Coincidence? No one believed that anymore. Next came the physical evidence. The plastic cup found in cell 17 had already been discarded by the time investigators arrived, thrown away as routine trash. But the janitor on duty that morning, a meticulous older man named Leo Patterson, remembered something strange. She never took drinks from anyone, he said. Always drank from the sink, straight from the tap. But that morning, I saw a cup on the floor. Little bit of orange stuff at the bottom. Thought it was juice. I didn't think much of it, just tossed it. Unfortunately, by the time they tracked down the trash bag, it had already been incinerated. No way to test it now. But Patterson's memory was enough to point the investigation in a new direction. If Natalie had received a drink something flavored, sweet, it meant someone had brought it to her, and the only people authorized to deliver food or liquids to solitary inmates were correctional staff. Specifically, supervisors and medical personnel. The task force pulled access logs, shift records, and incident reports from the past 72 hours. They zeroed in on the overnight staff roster for the night of the blackout. Only 1 officer had been assigned to Cell Block C during that window. Scott Murdoch. 17-year veteran, clean record, low complaints. A known introvert but never flagged for misconduct. To most of his coworkers, he was invisible reliable, quiet, easy to overlook. But to investigators, he was now the only name on a very short list. They looked closer. Scott's badge had registered entry to Cell Block C at 1:44 a.m. routine cell check. Nothing unusual. But then, something strange. At 2:18 a.m., the door to cell 17 had been opened again. No badge swipe. No override code. Just a manual unlock. The kind that bypassed the digital log. Investigators checked the door's mechanical register. Sure enough, it had been opened manually from the inside. Scott later claimed it was a software glitch. I only did the one check, he told them during the first interview. Whatever else is in there must be wrong. But they weren't buying it. Because the system wasn't the only thing giving him away. 2 weeks earlier, a different camera located in the north hallway outside Solitary had caught Scott entering the corridor during his break. He wasn't on rotation. He wasn't on a scheduled round. And in his hand was a paper bag and a water bottle. Not against protocol, but odd. He stayed in the corridor for 17 minutes. No incident report filed, no log entry, no explanation. Still not enough to arrest him, but enough to raise suspicion. When investigators brought him in again, Scott looked worse, unshaven, pale, eyes bloodshot. He fidgeted through the entire interview, avoided eye contact, gave short, clipped answers. I didn't kill her, he said. You really think I'd throw away my whole life for someone like that? It was a defensive answer. Too defensive. The room went quiet. And that's when one of the investigators leaned forward and asked a question that would change everything. Did she ever threaten you? Scott didn't flinch, didn't ask who, didn't clarify. He just answered, "She said if I didn't help her get the baby out, she'd report everything. Said she'd name names." Silence. The team stared at him. They hadn't said anything about a baby. Not its condition. Not whether it had survived. Not even that it was fully developed. But Scott knew. He knew she had been pregnant. He knew how far along she was. He knew more than he should have. And suddenly, it was clear. This wasn't just suspicion. This wasn't just theory. This man had been in that room. And now, all the cracks in the system pointed in one direction. Straight to him. He thought he could make it disappear, that one silent act could erase the truth. But truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. And Scott Murdoch was running out of lies. They didn't arrest him right away. The evidence was building. Yes, the camera blackout, the unlogged door access, the knowledge about the pregnancy that no one outside the morgue should have known, but it still wasn't enough. Not for a conviction, not yet. So instead, they watched. They followed Scott Murdoch's routine. They monitored his movements, studied his behavior, reviewed every surveillance feed from the past 6 months that even vaguely involved Cell 17, and they waited for him to slip. He didn't make it easy. Scott stopped talking to his coworkers. He avoided the break room, called in sick more frequently. His uniform became wrinkled, his face unshaven. On more than one occasion, he was seen sitting in his car outside the prison gates for hours after his shift ended, staring at nothing, just sitting there. Engine off, hands clenched on the wheel. The investigators took notes. Because they knew what they were watching wasn't guilt. It was erosion. And then came the mistake. It was a follow-up interview, meant to be routine, just a few clarifications. But the investigator in charge, a woman named Layla Franks, was sharper than most, and she knew that sometimes all it took was the right question, asked the wrong way. She leaned forward, calm, casual. "Scott," she said, "I know this is uncomfortable, but we have to ask, did Natalie ever threaten you, use the pregnancy to manipulate you?" He didn't hesitate. "She said if I didn't help her get the baby out, she'd go public, said she'd blow everything up." The air in the room shifted. Layla blinked. "Help her get the baby out." Scott froze. That phrase? No one had said anything about the baby surviving. No one had told him it had been viable, that it was fully formed, that it had been strangled by the lack of oxygen caused by the poison, its lungs never given the chance to draw a breath. But Scott already knew. And now they knew that he knew. He looked around, panicked, realizing his slip too late. His hands shook. He tried to backpedal. "I mean," she said, "if I didn't listen to her, I don't know. It was all messed up." But it was done. That was the crack. And from there, everything else began to fall apart. They pressed harder, reviewed more logs, reanalyzed the audio from his earlier interviews, compared phrasing, demeanor, timeline, and a picture began to form not of a man framed or a man seduced, but of a man terrified. Terrified of losing everything. His job, his pension, his reputation, his children. Terrified of being labeled a predator, a rapist, a traitor to the uniform. And that fear had metastasized into something darker. They brought him in one final time. This time, Scott didn't look angry. He looked empty. Layla sat across from him. "We don't need to hear the whole thing, just the truth. Why did you do it?" He stared at his hands. "Because she was going to ruin me." No denial. Just confession. She didn't threaten me outright. She didn't have to. It was the way she looked at me, like she knew she had already won. His voice was hoarse. She smiled when she told me, said the baby was mine, said the law would protect her, that she couldn't be executed while pregnant, and after the birth, maybe an appeal, maybe sympathy, maybe life instead of death. Layla let the silence hang. Scott continued. "I thought about turning myself in. I really did. I couldn't sleep. I was shaking all the time. I knew I screwed up. But if this got out, everything I built, it would be gone." "So you poisoned her," Layla said softly. Scott nodded. "I didn't want it to hurt. I needed it to be fast, quiet. I gave her juice, just a little. Said it was good for the baby. And she drank it. She didn't even blink. She smiled, like she expected it." He wiped his face with both hands, then looked up, red-eyed. I think she always knew this was going to happen." Layla frowned. "Why do you say that?" "Because," he whispered, "she never talked about the baby like it was real, never asked about names, never touched her belly, never once said anything about hope. It wasn't a child to her. It was a weapon." And with that, the interview ended. Scott Murdoch was arrested that same night. Second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of power, misconduct in a correctional facility. He didn't resist. Didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat in the back of the patrol car, staring straight ahead as the gates of Elmridge closed behind him. In the end, it wasn't her manipulation that killed him. It was his fear. The fear of being exposed. The fear of losing control. And the crushing truth that no prison is stronger than a secret once it starts to rot from the inside out. The courtroom was packed. Not with curious bystanders or nosy reporters, though they were there, but with people who had once trusted Scott Murdoch, fellow officers, supervisors, nurses, even the janitor who had found the discarded cup. They filled the benches in silence, eyes low, arms crossed, as the man they had worked beside for 17 years sat at the defense table, shackled at the ankles. He didn't look up, not once. The prosecution didn't waste time. They painted the picture with precision: a veteran correctional officer, emotionally unstable, seduced by a manipulative death row inmate. When faced with the consequences of his actions, a pregnancy, a ruined career, a scandal that could destroy everything, he made a calculated choice: kill her, quietly, without evidence, without noise, just a glass of juice, just enough cyanide to stop a heartbeat. They brought out the camera logs, the manual door override, the 31-minute blackout. They showed the transcript from Scott's third interview, the one where he mentioned getting the baby out before anyone told him the baby had been viable. And then they played the tape. His own words. "She didn't even blink. She just drank it, like she expected it." That silence in the courtroom was heavier than any verdict. The defense tried. They painted Natalie as a master manipulator, a predator who used her beauty and charm to seduce a broken man. They argued that Scott had been used, emotionally blackmailed, driven to the edge by psychological abuse, that he had made a terrible mistake, but one rooted in fear, not cruelty. He thought he had no choice. The defense attorney told the jury, she didn't just manipulate him with sex. She used the child. She weaponized hope, and she pushed him until he snapped. But the jury didn't blink. They didn't care about excuses. Not when a woman had been poisoned in her cell, Not when a baby had died before it could draw breath. They deliberated for less than a day. Guilty. Second-degree murder, misconduct, tampering with evidence. Scott Murdoch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Not death. Not like Natalie. Some called it justice. Others called it mercy. But inside Elmridge Penitentiary, the fallout didn't stop with Scott. The warden, Thomas Vega, was quietly removed from his post 2 weeks later. No press conference, no statement, just a memo and an empty office. 3 other staff members resigned under pressure. 2 medical employees were suspended indefinitely for falsifying or overlooking wellness reports that should have raised red flags about Natalie's condition. 1 guard was reassigned after admitting he had suspected something, but was afraid to speak up. And then came the lawsuit. Natalie's family, the same family that had refused to speak to her for nearly a decade, filed a civil suit against the state and the prison. They didn't claim she was innocent. They didn't defend her past. But they argued that, even as a condemned inmate, she had rights. The right to carry her child to term. The right to due process. The right to face death legally, not to be poisoned like a stray dog. The state settled out of court. No public record of the amount. No official admission of wrongdoing. But everyone at Elmridge knew the damage had already been done. For years, Elmridge had been hailed as a model facility. High-tech, high security, no escapes, no scandals. The gold standard of isolation. Now, it was a cautionary tale. Used in seminars, quoted in ethics training, whispered about in every new officer orientation. Remember Elmridge, that's what happens when you ignore the cracks. In the weeks that followed, new policies were drafted. Pregnancy testing protocols were updated. Toxicology screenings became standard for all in-custody deaths. Camera logs were double audited, and solitary confinement procedures were placed under federal review. But none of it would bring her back. Not Natalie. And not the child who never had a name. The trial had ended. The files were sealed, but one question still echoed in every hallway of that prison. Did she plan this? Did Natalie Rivers seduce a man just to create a baby she never intended to raise? Was it a scheme to avoid execution? A final act of control? Or was she, in the end, just as afraid of dying alone as anyone else? No one knows. Because the only person who could answer that was buried in an unmarked grave. After the trial, Elmridge went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the heavy, haunted silence of a place that knows it failed. Inmates whispered, guards kept their heads down. The new warden replaced the carpet in his office, but the floorboards still creaked the same way. Every camera in solitary was double-wired now. Every officer's access logs audited twice a week. But no amount of policy could scrub away what had happened in Cell 17. Natalie Rivers had died in the most secure wing of the most secure prison in the state. And she hadn't died screaming. She hadn't been executed by the law. She had been silenced, quietly, deliberately, poisoned in the night by a man wearing a badge. And no one, not the Department of Corrections, not the guards, not even the system that sentenced her, could stop what came next. Because Natalie left behind more than a corpse. She left behind a question. A crack in the foundation. A ghost that no one could bury. The baby, her baby never took a breath. His lungs never filled. His heart had been strong. His body fully formed. But the poison that killed his mother had passed through her bloodstream like a curse, cutting off oxygen, severing his future before it began. He was never named. Never placed on a birth certificate. Never claimed by anyone. Not even Natalie's family asked to retrieve the remains. He was cremated unceremoniously, his ashes stored for 90 days, then destroyed per standard procedure, another line in another cold report. But for a brief moment, just a heartbeat in time, he had held power. The power to stop an execution. The power to rewrite headlines. The power to unravel a system built on control. And that terrified them. In the months that followed, investigative journalists dug deeper. How could a pregnant woman go unnoticed for 8 months? How did no one ask questions? Why weren't there regular wellness exams? What had been overlooked or ignored to allow this to happen? Answers came slowly. Unconvincingly. Reports had been altered. Routine checkups skipped. One nurse admitted, off the record, that she had once seen Natalie clutching her stomach but dismissed it as indigestion. She was always quiet, didn't complain. We figured she just wanted to be left alone. She did. But not for the reason they thought. Because maybe, just maybe, Natalie didn't want to be saved. Maybe the pregnancy wasn't about mercy. Maybe it was about control. The final card. The last lever of power. She couldn't escape her sentence, couldn't run, couldn't plead for forgiveness. But she could manipulate. She could seduce a guard. She could carry a child under their noses. And if the baby survived, she could challenge the sentence, delay it, use the media, the courts, public sympathy. And if she died, then she'd still win, because her death wouldn't be quiet. And it wasn't. The case became a political firestorm. Senators issued statements. Advocacy groups protested outside Elmridge for weeks. Some demanded tighter surveillance. Others called for the abolition of solitary confinement. One national outlet ran a headline that simply read, "The baby in cell 70." It didn't matter who his mother was. It didn't matter what she had done. In death, he became a symbol of failure, of secrecy, of a system more afraid of exposure than of murder. And Scott Murdoch. He was moved to a different facility, isolated, protected. A former guard behind bars was never safe, even among other inmates. He spent 23 hours a day in a new kind of solitude, the kind you don't come back from. He never appealed, never gave another interview, never spoke Natalie's name again. But the investigators who sat across from him, who watched his shoulders slump, his voice shake, his eyes empty out, they said the same thing. He wasn't afraid of what he'd done. He was afraid that she'd always been one step ahead. And maybe she had. Because whatever Natalie Rivers was, trafficker, manipulator, monster, she was also a survivor. And survivors know how to make themselves unforgettable. Years later, Elmridge still bears her scars. There's a new policy now. All female inmates, death row or not, are given quarterly pregnancy screenings. There's a new protocol for camera blackouts, automatic lockdowns, and alerts. There's a new training module in every officer's orientation. It's called the Cell 17 Failure. Natalie Rivers died in a concrete box, pregnant and alone. But her story refused to stay buried. And maybe that was her plan all along. If this story left you breathless, speechless, or stunned, hit subscribe, because the next one might just be worse.